Thank you very much. I'm actually trying to get to the slides here. There we go. So just so that I might have a little bit more credibility. So I've been doing this for 40 years. I'm a former executive from Visa. Before that, HP Professional Services. But more interesting to you all is that as part of my position with 8x8, which is 157 countries, a $2 billion phone company, that kind of thing. I represent 8x8 to the American Bar Association. You probably know that the Board of Governors in the American Bar Association has a lot to do with all those regulations that have been imposed or not imposed yet that Ray talked about. Also, we're pretty privileged, I guess, to say that we're working with a DARPA-funded project with Stanford Research. So DARPA is the place where they have Area 51 and all that. And that one becomes very interesting because we briefed Congress and the Senate. And so 8x8's actually been involved in preparing those briefings for various congressional and Senate committees and various other things. And I won't trouble you further with more information about that. Today we're going to try to bring it home for you all to make sure that we add to what Ray had already said and try to make sure that it's something that you can actually use when you go back to your office. In other words, why should you care and what can you really do? Even as Ray said, a lot of people think, well, GDPR, that's Europe, CCPA, that's California, but as Ray said, even here in Louisiana, there's a number of things going on that you all need to know about. Let's talk about you personally for a minute. Let's just even move away from you as individual company owners or executives. Let's talk about what would happen if when you got home tonight, or even before that, your wife is calling because she's upset, and she says that all of your 401k or your bank account has been cleaned out. So as part of what we do at 8x8, we're part of a group that supports strategic infrastructure in the U.S. That means working with the FBI. I'm actually a cyber chief for the FBI myself. We get people, quite often, I've had 5 come to my office in the last quarter whose financial concerns have been just cleaned out. What hackers can do now, because they have everything they need to call up your bank, your stockbroker, your 401k, and other things relating to your finances, provide your various secret information, your social security number and other things, and authenticate themselves enough that they can move your money. What do they do with it then? They move it into Bitcoins, into a Bitcoin mixer, and I can tell you folks that once that's happened, not the Secret Service Crime Task Force, not FBI, not IC3, and by the way, IC3 is who you report that to, and guess what? They get 100 people a minute reporting to them, 100 a minute. Can you imagine all that sadness of people who worked all their lives to develop their 401k and their bank account, right? And it's a limited team in the FBI, IC3. I can tell you from somewhat personal experience of people that come to me that if you haven't had a huge amount stolen, like 5 million, they won't have time for you. So it's gone. So what do you do? What do you do to protect yourself? And then let's move that to your business as well. The same thing could happen to your business funds. What can you do? Any volunteers? Anybody have an idea? How about you, sir?
You can lock your credit, so some people can't run your credit, open up accounts.
That's one of the things you can do. You can watch your credit a little bit more. But the thing that you may find useful, right? No guarantees. Let's have a disclaimer here. The legal responsibilities. You can get 3-factor or multi-factor authentication. Ray talked a lot about that. What does that mean? Every financial concern in the U.S. is required by law to provide you with another form of authentication. This may be an application for your phone, right? That enables you to have a randomly generated number you put behind your password or in place of your password, things like that. That makes it very difficult for hackers to get to you. And let me also add that I and some of the people we employ, well, some of the people we employ at least, are some of the best hackers in the world. So I know of what I speak there. Okay, let's move on. So just to make sure that we have your attention, there are a few things going on in the world today that you may or may not be aware of. Ray touched on a good many of them. But one of them is that how many people actually know that there's 11 agencies that your taxes are paying for that are actively waging cyber war in the U.S.? Any hands? Anybody been aware of that already? I don't see too many hands there. Unfortunately, as Ray said, the tools that they use to do that active cyber war attacking to hostile state governments and organized crime, which, by the way, work together these days, have been stolen. I think some of you out there might be involved in healthcare, maybe some attorneys in the legal area. So this is kind of sad, right? Because some of those attack tools that were turned against U.S. companies actually brought down the systems sufficiently in U.S. hospitals that some hospitals and other care providers were actually shut down. People in emergency services on their way to those hospitals sometimes didn't make it, and other very sad scenarios came about as a result of that. Another thing that you may or may not be aware of, I think Ray touched on it, was that many U.S. companies, even the majority of our strategic infrastructure, think water, power, communications, things like that, have been penetrated. I come from Visa before I went to this company. When I first came to Visa, which is many years ago now, and became a leader in security there, I was brought in secret to see evidence that back then, which is over 10 years ago, the Chinese government had penetrated and fully mapped Visa. And I can assure you that they have done so to most of our major U.S. companies. Unfortunately, they've also done it sufficiently in our strategic resources that should there be escalations of some form, there could be some dire consequences. The U.S. is working on that. We can talk more about that later. The other part is that how many people are aware of the magnitude of counterfeit chips in our life, right? Think about your car. Probably more than half of the chips in your car are counterfeit. Many of those have back doors that'll allow, again, if there's some kind of escalation of political activity for hostile state governments and organized crime to get in there. Now, you're going to see more government regulations. As a phone company, we're getting it a lot now, for supply chain management. That means that you need to talk to your suppliers to find out if they have been checking for counterfeit chips, right? And by the way, the answer you get from your supplier is going to tell you a lot about them, whether or not they've been checking that. One of the things that Congress and the Senate are concerned about now, and Cyber Command and some other groups, is the fact that because of the social engineering that hostile state governments have been doing, they have been influencing the thinking of free world countries. Many people agree that not only our election, but that of Brexit and other groups around the world were heavily influenced by quote-unquote fake news. Many of you have had personal experiences with that. And what's really kind of scary is that, as you're probably aware, our younger generation get almost all their news from that social arena. Ray mentioned that phishing and social engineering attacks are very prevalent today. Actually, they're at a pandemic level, right? According to Cyber Command and to the FBI, they're at their highest level in recent history. I think all of you have been attempted victims, at least, of that kind of thing. One of the things we always recommend from a security standpoint is if you are in any way questioning an email, please don't open it. 30–40% of the new emails are automated and can actually result in a ransomware attack on your hard disk, right? Encrypting it, and by the way, if you do actually pay the ransom, you'll be marked up on the organized crime and hostile state government marketing list, and you'll probably get a lot more attacks than you would before that. Some people have had some interesting experiences with that. Ray mentioned HIPAA, but it's been my experience, and I was a board member for HIMSS, the largest healthcare IT organization, and I'm currently a cyber chief for healthcare with the FBI as a volunteer. It's been my experience in public speaking that the majority of people, or at least more than not, who are subject to HIPAA regulations are not aware of it. So one of the things to keep in mind, and I know Ray covered some of this, is if you transport, store, or process, just to put it in basic terms, on a regular business basis, any information related to or on behalf of covered entities, which are healthcare providers, our payers, and all the people in between, then you are susceptible to HIPAA regulations. Please be sure that you find out from your legal or security authority whether or not you need to meet HIPAA regulations. The fines can be somewhat devastating, as Ray mentioned. However, civil lawsuits are even worse. So one of the groups I belong to mentors people in becoming leaders for healthcare security. One of the groups that we had, that's a California Marin County major hospital, did have a breach of one of its third parties, and the civil lawsuits are now over 20 million. So it can be brutal. And the interesting part, and Ray started to talk about this, I'll just mention it briefly. Now, because of GDPR, CCPA, and other things, you're responsible for your third party. So let's think about that for a minute. So wait a minute. You have a third party that's providing some of the processing power for you. How many people, how many third parties behind that are involved with that third party? And remember, you're responsible, right? So people now are trying to keep track of all the different third parties involved. Let's talk about credit cards for a little bit. So I come from Visa. I was actually on the PCI standards board for a time. Not the most fun thing I ever did. And I can tell you that there are a lot of things now that that folks are not completely aware of in the new PCI regulations in the last couple of years. From a business consulting standpoint, we run into somebody 2 or 3 times a day that wasn't aware of one thing or another for PCI. So as a service to y'all, we wanted to make sure that you're aware of some of the gotchas that we're finding at that level of frequency. So one of them is, you guys know that the secret number on the back of a Visa card, the front of an Amex card, that's called CVV2 or derivative thereof, can never be stored in your systems at any level of encryption. Not homomorphic, not elliptic curve, not even some of the new very sophisticated encryptions. It just is, you cannot store it. And it's interesting how many people, how many businesses we work with that we're not aware of that. They're writing it down or putting it on voice recordings. Another thing is that even the rest of the information that you're involved with, are you completely aware of everything you need to do to avoid fines in that area, right? So there, you have to have every system that's storing credit card information has to be separated by a discrete firewall and what we call a DMZ. And then that system itself has to have checks and balances on it that show records, even that you have to hold for 7 years, of anyone who made any kind of change in the code in that system. It gets very complicated. In addition, everything from data in motion to data at rest on a hard disk has to meet what the credit card companies or PCIstandards.org says is strong encryption. So there are a lot of things there. Here's an easy way out. Anybody interested in that? Not have to do all that stuff? Usually costs about $500,000 to put all those systems in place, even for a small company. Okay, here's the out for you. The standards.org has come up with something called SAC-A. That's the self-assessment that you have to do. SAC-A is where you go to a certified, and please be careful that it's really certified. Visa has a global registry of certified PCI solution providers. CyberSource is one that I can mention because it's part of Visa. They can set up a system for you where where all the code involved in taking your customer's credit card is controlled by them. That means you're absolved from, and again, I'm taking no legal responsibility for this here, but you're absolved from having to do all those other things. The attestation you need to make, SAC-A, compared to others, is just a few lines of things that you have to agree to, mostly around having some basic security in your organization, not anything like I said earlier. And your CyberSource or your PCI service provider takes responsibility for everything else. They will then hold all your customer credit card information and provide you back what we call a token, which can be the last 4 or 5 or whatever, and then you can use that for rebilling, right? So by doing that, you're absolved, it's like a safe harbor from most of that responsibility. We talked a little about GDPR, and I think Ray has probably covered that sufficiently. But one of the things I noticed he didn't say is, are you all aware of all these different things that the Europeans and to some extent CCPA consider to be sensitive personal information? That's even patterns. So I think most of you are aware that when a European citizen recently asked Yahoo or one of the social engineering companies for all of her information, it took them weeks, and they came up with terabytes of data, right? Because it could be anything that can determine a pattern. Like in a telephone company, it's how long you call different numbers, how often you call them, how often people call you. Those things are areas where we could determine a pattern and uniquely identify you. So just be aware that that's going on. So we have a lot of people, and I've even talked to some people last night here that recommend that you have strong firewalls and other basic security features. But guess what? A good hacker can work around those like they aren't even there. How do they do that? Look at these that are up on the board here, the screen. These are some of the largest hacks that have happened. How did they happen? So let's just say all of you right now are in charge of the IT department. You're the CIO or whatever. If I were to ask you as a CIO of your company, hypothetically, are you aware of every old section of code that your developers might have written or you might have gotten from a third party 20 years ago, 15 years ago? Do you know of everything in there that at one point had open internet access? Guess what? Hackers will exploit that, and so far in my 40 years hate to say this, we've never found a company who couldn't be hacked this way, right? So what's the advice there? Make sure that you're using good, ethical hackers, that you get them from a major hacking services company, and they will try to find those holes for you, because they basically just lower the drawbridge and invite the bad guys in. And believe me, they're finding that quite often, more so all the time now. So ethical hackers are a good idea. We're going to talk about some of the things you can do, and Ray and Darryl will talk more about it. You really should have, in my personal opinion, an expert come in and help you with this. It is fairly complicated. So how about if we have a test now? All those things that Ray showed you for the NIST environment, you have those all locked in memory, right? Every detail. So that's where experts come in handy. These are some of the basics that Ray has already gone over to some extent. Here's an example of a company, and I apologize in advance for using our company, 8x8. But we have gone into great lengths for the last 6 or 7 years, spent huge amounts of money, hundreds and hundreds of thousands, to achieve the NIST standards. And I can tell you, having just refreshed them, there's 200 documents in NIST 853. Now, the small business NIST that they were talking about is much more achievable and practical, but if you're dealing with federal government financial services, you need those. So those are some of the things. Here's a key point. You really, and most of you are in leadership positions here for your company. You need to show by example that setting a tone of security, and do you know what governance is? Governance is where you kind of don't let people get away with not doing security, and that is a corporate culture, right? And you, when you have people in development or in operations or whatever that are doing some good security things, it's a good idea to reward them in front of everyone else. Peer pressure is one of the strongest incentives for security. But if you're not coming down from the top and you're not working with all of these practices, then it's going to be very difficult for you to meet some of these new governance standards. So here's some of the things that you need to be looking at. Anymore now, I don't know about you guys, but as head of security at the moment for our company, I get 2 or 3 calls a day. In fact, I got called out of a meeting yesterday from major customers that want these kinds of assurances. Now, here's a secret for building your business that served me well for the last 40 years. You can actually make security and now data privacy as a selling point. So why did 8x8 spend all the money to do these things? Let me tell you that once we had done those, we started getting huge, logarithmically larger customers, and I believe you will too. Even at Visa, this worked. I was with HP Professional Services before that, worked with hundreds of accounts, and I can tell you that it's saleable. You can market it very effectively, and people like Darryl can help you achieve that. Some of the things that you risk by not doing it, need I say more? There's a lot, right? It's huge today. But the main thing is, why not look at it from a positive standpoint? If you can achieve some of these new compliances, I don't remember if Ray in his great talk this morning talked about SOC 2, right? But that's a popular one now. Often if you just can advertise it on your web, the ISOs that Wayne mentioned. And of course, the NIST cybersecurity framework is even more advanced than those and more impressive to your customers. So here's some of the basics. Ray gave you a lot of detail, right? You remember every detail though, right? Yeah. You're nodding, okay. Here's some of the basics that you need to take in mind. So when a security professional comes into a company cold, they want to do an analysis, as you've heard this almost beat to death, a risk analysis, but they want to know where the most important data is. And you know what? It's interesting that you can go to most companies today and they will not, there will be parts of their data that they're not aware of, right? So that's really pertinent and important. You need to then figure out how to protect the areas that are secure once you've found them. And of course, one of the reasons to work with Darryl and his team and others like that is that a lot of the things that I've seen in my career, for instance, is people go overboard, right? They actually do, they try to achieve more than is practical and pragmatic, and that's some wordage that you'll find in some of the HIPAA, by the way, policies from the government, that's practical and pragmatic for your company. I never recommend that you do any more than is going to make you money, right, and secure you from greater corporate risk. That's another reason to work with experts in this field. So some of the things that you need to do with them here, and I'm going to move on since we're probably running out of time, but you absolutely need to protect, and I know that you've heard this so many times in your life, but the CIA of your company, right? The confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Wait a minute, what does integrity mean in this case? Remember when Standard & Poor's and LexisNexis were like the Bible? You could depend on everything they say. Now you cannot, right? Now, because they've been hacked so much, they've lost their integrity. The FBI brings us into talks quite often. Think about if you lose the integrity of your data, think of a retailer whose database has been changed and they're sending spoiled milk out, you know, a long ways in their trucks, or they're moving them to the wrong places or whatever. It can ruin your business, and that's one of the things that Washington's concerned about, that it's being hacked. So CIA of your data, availability, of course. Now, since the late 80s, there's been something called, that started out being called SANS Top 20, now it's CIS Top 20. Guess what? Every major country has a version of this. These are the 20 things that will be covered in the NIST small business, but this is just a smaller, I guess you might say, more simplified way of looking at it. These are the things, folks, you must do these things. If you're going to protect yourself in this day and age, these are the things that at the bottom minimum basis you must do. And you're going to get a copy of these slides, right? So, and you can go to the CIS website. They have a huge amount of information there. And of course, they cross-reference that with the NIST small business. Here's the second set of things. Basically, it's when you first start, you need to make sure you know what all your systems are, right? Does everybody know every system that every person in your organization has now? Yeah, I see some smiles. Okay. Then software. Software gets really complicated, right? Especially today. Today with you hire third party A and they've got third parties B, C, and D behind them, right? Are they all secure? Or are they all, is even one of them already penetrated and providing a conduit right into your system, right? What about the vulnerabilities? Are you guys, you're probably doing scanning to make sure that all your patching is updated, although I know some healthcare facilities have trouble with that because they can't really shut down some of their critical systems and emergency room and so forth. Then there's a number of other things. As I talked about, how many of you are, if you're involved with a third party that does coding, you're doing coding yourself, are following secure coding standards, right? We all went from waterfall to agile to DevOps, you know, which is supposed to be the really fast way to code. But in order to do that, and to use all those new acronyms that they're using now for clouds like Kubernetes and so forth, you need to be using a lot of open source and shareware software. Your developers are trying to leverage that as much as possible. But wait a minute, is it secure? What kind of APIs are you using, REST or SOAP? You know, REST APIs are less secure. Are you just depending on AWS because you're putting it there, right? But what about all the things you need to do to make it secure in AWS? So there's a lot of things going on here. And one of them, just even one of them is, are your coders actually coding in a way that makes it easy for people to hack you, right? Let alone, are you building in the intelligence to be able to track personal information, right? So with that, we're giving you a few additional resources here. And that is not only including that 20 basic things that can be tied to the NIST Small Business Framework, but here's the URL for the Small Business Framework again for you. And those of you who are involved in communications, here's what the Federal Communications Commission is asking as well. And Darryl, did you have some things to add to this?
Yeah, well, so my first job up here was in case he started getting to too many acronyms, I was supposed to pull him back out, but you did good. So congratulations. I didn't have much of a job. But you brought up a couple of things. First, some plugs for our firm. That's awesome. I'll buy you lunch. It's coming up a little later. But a couple of things you talked about that I thought were interesting. We'll kick off maybe some questions, certainly, from the audience. One was, I'm curious. I mean, you're with a telecommunications firm. So if you could address where you're seeing that become important with regards to cybersecurity, because most organizations don't think about telecommunications when it comes to security. And I think that'd be very interesting to talk about. And then secondly, the scariest thing you may have said today was the information about counterfeit chips, and that as many as 50% could be counterfeit. And so maybe you could go a little deeper on that of what does that really mean, what's the exposure, and what's being done about it, if anything.
Absolutely, thank you. And thanks for bringing up communications. And I really try not to be commercial here. But certainly all of you depend on your communications, and you know, that's why our company gets to work with the FBI and others like that, as communications are considered strategic to our strategic resources in the U.S. Picking a communications vendor, I mean, you can imagine I have some pretty passionate thoughts about that. One of the reasons I went to work with this company is very important. You need to make sure that that communication vendor does all of these things, right? You need to never take their word for it. You need to make sure that they can provide you with these kind of certifications so that you're not taking your third party, and this is not just true in communications vendor, but anyone else, you're not just taking your third party's word for it, you're taking KPMG, you know, Accenture, some kind of major auditor that's been in and certified that company as having you know, whatever level of security is involved. Some of the things that can get you in trouble with communications, okay? So from a HIPAA, CCPA, GDPR, just about any kind of data privacy area, and sorry, I work with the UK a lot, so that comes out with the British pronunciation sometimes. Any company that's doing that must be able to prove to you, you must get evidence or evidentiary proof from them that they are providing strong encryption for the voice medium going across the wire. 8x8 does that, for instance. And strong encryption at rest for any of your voicemails or voice recordings. So let's talk about that for a second. So how many of you have call centers? Pretty much everybody, I'm guessing. Come on, raise your hand. You have a call center. Okay. So how many of you in your call centers work with a call center vendor that's able to automatically, this is important now, that is able to automatically turn off the recording when it comes time for that call center agent of yours to take someone's credit card? I'm not seeing any hands at all. I bet there is some, but so for instance, 8x8, when I first got there 7 years ago, we made that mandatory. So we provide an API with our call center software that automatically turns off the call recording so that you're not recording sensitive credit card or personal information on your system, or ours, by the way. So, and then of course we recommend that you're using someone like CyberSource where the call center agent is actually typing in the information, that's what we call an iframe or something like that. And that real estate on the web page is actually owned by another group. So again, you're absolved of that responsibility. That is huge, folks. Please pay attention to that if you remember nothing else. In addition to that, there's all of the other aspects that we talked about here that need to be addressed for this and the small business. And in our case, we deal with very strategic entities here and in the UK and in other countries where lives are at stake and so forth. So we have to meet not only the small business but the larger Nest standards. So those are the kind of things you want to look for your communications company. If for no other reason than the fact that you don't want to be bothered by your communications going out right when you need it. You got your largest account, you're trying to close a deal today, that kind of thing. Okay, the second one. So supply chain. So there's two aspects of supply chain. One of them is this new, what a lot of people consider, frankly, to be a new thought, right? And that is, okay, how many of you have mapped out every partner that you're working with? Anybody? You have. I'm very impressed.
For manufacturing.
Okay, that makes it easier. Yeah. And of course, you've got SCADA to worry about too, right? Okay, so interestingly enough, very few companies know every third party that they're working with, their marketing, their development, or bringing them in all the time, let alone the third parties that are supporting them. So that's part of supply chain management. And believe me, you are going to be required to know that pretty soon if you're not already by the accounts that you're working with. Then the second thing, as Darryl brought up, is the counterfeit chips. So you probably think that your Apple or your iPhone is secure. It's not. It is almost invariably hacked. And it's probably hacked with something called a keyboard logger, which is looking for your passwords, right? And when they get it, they will find a way to exfiltrate it, right? So just be aware of that and be cautious about it. We can talk offline about ways to protect yourself there. Now let's finally get around to answering about the counterfeit chips. So I actually corresponded with Michael Eisenberg this morning just to make sure I was up to date. There are not a lot of companies that you can hire to do investigations of your partners. What you need to do, according to Michael Eisenberg, who's one of the heads of the American Bar Association focused on this, is to check with your vendors. So call up Dell. A lot of you probably work with Dell or Apple or whoever you're working with, and certainly your major vendors, and ask them if they have an SCRM program. That means supply chain management, right? If they answer no, or if they start trying to be evasive, that will tell you something. You should be aware of that. You should always be asking for your, certainly your major vendors.
Thank you. So why don't we open it up? I know we have a couple of, we have about 5 minutes. We have some microphones. Who's got some questions or wants to dive deeper into anything? Thought I saw one start to go up.
So what are you going to do when you get home tonight to protect your assets?
Turn them off.
Probably nothing, right? You probably won't, if you're, or like most of us, you won't get around to it. But I think you owe it to your family and your business. So any questions about how to protect your assets, about what to do first when you're trying to meet all these new regulatory requirements? Yes, sir. Question
So
here?
let's say you've got an electric utility substation that's filled with electronics and chips and so forth. Where do you start to determine whether or not you have a vulnerability problem through, let's say, counterfeit chips? Like, how do you attack that problem? Where do you start?
So again, one of the best things to do, and actually thank you so much for bringing that up. One of the key points that I actually intended to bring up here is, remember when I talked about how easy it is to hack most companies? Part of that is because of the chips, right? Strongly recommend you bring in a group of professionals who can bring in ethical hackers, right? They will find, the back doors. That's their job. And that, in my opinion, so my personal experience over the last 40 years, for what that's worth, is that you can hire companies that are supposed to do that, et cetera, et cetera. But until you've had a very senior, knowledgeable, ethical hacker try to find ways in, they do that, they call that manual testing. That's your best bet. And they'll find other things that you need to know. But again, look for the basics in these top 20 first, and work with a professional, in my opinion.
And what I would add to that, because Ray touched on it and Mike even touched on it as well, and these top 20 things are covered a lot by the NIST cybersecurity framework. And so if you work your way through it, it's a painstaking process, but to know what you have, if you follow that process, it will help you map out everything that you have and where it is. I mean, Ray talked earlier about follow the data, but you also now have to know all the devices that you have and what data is located on each of those. So if you work through that process, especially a larger organization, it could be very difficult, but that's the only way you're going to know what you have. And I think that is a good program to follow, to start, if you don't know where to start, is with the NIST cybersecurity framework.
And I don't know if you're aware, but dozens and dozens of people spent years pouring their hearts into that. It's a recipe book for what to look for. And the chips are kind of scary, right? But as Darryl said, there's a lot of other things that are kind of low-hanging fruit that make it really easy to penetrate you, right?
Hi. For laptops and phones that have fingerprint instead of password, I know laptops and phones now, like my bank can do a fingerprint instead of me typing in my password.
Yeah.
How much more secure is that than just the password alone? And is it a solution to some of this?
So that's a great question. Thank you so much. Biologic is becoming more prevalent now. Even in addition to the fingerprints and so forth, which I don't know about you, but mine don't always work the way they're supposed to. There's also now facial recognition and other things, right? They're getting better and better at that. Now, that's just logging onto your device, though, right? That's not logging onto your bank account, unless you're doing something that I'm not aware of. And it's not logging into your 401k or your stock account or whatever. And those, you need to have that additional form of authentication, right? That what we call 2FA. And that could be like a little app on your phone that generates a random number of 6 or 8 digits. That, if you take away nothing else today other than the need for a professional and having them come in to check the low-hanging fruit, please think about using two-factor authentication. Please think about using two-factor authentication for your financial accounts as a business and as a person.
All right, anything else? We're about at the end of time anyway. All right, well, Mike's going to be around during the breaks and lunch and so forth, so thank you very much, Mike. It was great. All right.